Scroll disclaimer for the story. It started as an innocent massage, but then he crossed the line. This story is a work of fiction and is intended solely for emotional storytelling and awareness purposes. It contains sensitive themes, including unwanted physical advances and emotional trauma, which may be disturbing or triggering to some readers. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real-life situations is purely coincidental. The intention of this narrative is not to sensationalize, but to shed light on the complex emotions, confusion, and courage that survivors often experience. Elena sat in her car, massaging her own shoulders with one hand as she stared at the glowing Wellness Haven sign across the street. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, constant ache that no amount of stretching or heat pads seemed to fix anymore. After working 12-hour night shifts at the hospital for the past few years, her body had started sending warning signals. And she had ignored them for too long. Her friend and colleague, Maria, had recommended this place. "Ray is the best," she had said. "Professional, quiet, and he really listens. You'll feel brand new afterward." Still, Elena hesitated. She wasn't one to let strangers touch her, no matter how professional they were. But desperation often silences doubt, and so, after 2 weeks of wrestling with the idea, here she was finally about to go in. Inside, the studio was minimal but cozy. Dim lighting, soft music, and the smell of lavender oil immediately calmed her nerves. Ray emerged from behind a curtain, a tall man in his late 30s with calm eyes and a gentle demeanor. He greeted her politely, asked a few medical questions, and explained the process without any unnecessary chatter. His voice was low and professional. As the massage began, Elena felt tension melt from her muscles. Ray's hands were skilled, firm but respectful. He worked around her pressure points with precision, checking in with her from time to time about the pressure. There were no lingering touches, no odd comments. Just relief. When the hour was up, Elena sat up slowly, surprised by how much better she felt. Her back pain had dulled, her shoulders felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't clenching her jaw. Ray handed her a bottle of water and said, "You might feel a bit sore tomorrow, but that's normal. If you'd like, we can set up a routine to help with the long-term tension." She nodded, already feeling more open to the idea. That would be great. Driving home, Elena smiled to herself. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, a small space to heal her body and mind. Nothing felt strange or uncomfortable. It had been, quite honestly, a great first session. She didn't know then that what started as a simple act of self-care would soon take an unexpected and unwanted turn. Over the next month, Elena started seeing Ray once a week. What began as a hesitant decision soon turned into a regular part of her routine. Every session started the same: a polite greeting, a short check-in about her pain level, and then an hour of deep tissue massage that left her feeling lighter and more present in her own body. But more than the physical relief, there was something else that made Elena keep coming back: the comfort of being seen and listened to without judgment. Ray had a calming presence, and his quiet professionalism created a bubble of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. He never overshared, never pried too deeply, but he remembered details: how she liked the pressure on her shoulders, that she preferred eucalyptus oil, even that her mother was recovering from surgery. The small things made her feel safe. During one session, after a particularly stressful shift at the hospital, she found herself venting about a patient who reminded her of her late father. She hadn't meant to share something so personal, but Ray simply nodded and listened, saying nothing except, "That must have been hard." His voice was quiet, respectful, present. It was that non-intrusive empathy that made her feel more at ease. Soon, small talk turned into soft banter. She smiled more easily around him. She didn't feel the need to keep her emotional guard up the way she usually did around men. It wasn't flirtation, it felt like mutual comfort. He never crossed any lines, never said anything inappropriate. If anything, he gave her space, letting her set the tone of each visit. But one day, she noticed something subtle. As he adjusted the towel on her back, his fingers brushed just slightly against the curve of her waist, not aggressively, but in a way that felt more aware. Not professional. She didn't flinch, but she noticed. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe she was being overly sensitive. After all, Ray had been nothing but professional until now. One stray touch didn't mean anything, right? But the thought stayed with her. Long after the massage was over and she was home, tucked into bed, Elena kept thinking about that brief second. She wondered if she imagined it. She wanted to believe it had been unintentional, just part of the flow of the session. Still, she couldn't deny a shift within herself. The next time she saw him, she told herself she'd be more aware, more alert. Not because she didn't trust him, but because something had changed, and she wasn't sure what it meant. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. But a quiet whisper of doubt had begun to form, and once that whisper starts, it's hard to silence. Elena entered the studio with her usual calm, but there was a slight tension in her step, a quiet unease she hadn't felt in weeks. She told herself she was being silly. Overthinking. But the memory of that gentle brush of Ray's fingers against her waist hadn't left her since the last session. It had been such a small thing. But small things, when they carry the weight of instinct, can feel enormous. Ray greeted her the same way he always did, polite, composed, not overly friendly. Nothing in his tone or expression hinted at anything unusual. The room was warm and scented with lavender, just like always. Everything looked and felt the same, yet nothing felt the same inside her. She lay down on the table, trying to relax, trying to push away the overanalysis looping in her head. Maybe this session would prove it had all been in her mind. But midway through the massage, she felt it again. His hand pressed gently into her lower back, thumbs working the tight muscles near her spine. He shifted slightly, and his fingers lingered, not in a way that seemed medically necessary or professionally justified. Just a second too long. It was enough. Elena's body tensed, and she hoped he didn't notice. Her heart began to beat faster, and her mouth went dry. She didn't say anything. Didn't ask him to stop. She wanted to. But her throat felt frozen. She told herself again, maybe it was just part of the massage. Maybe I'm imagining it. Don't be dramatic. She lay still, silent, eyes wide open as he moved on to her shoulders. The rest of the session passed in uneasy quiet. He didn't say anything unusual, didn't make any overt moves. But her trust, once built slowly and delicately, had developed its first crack. It wasn't that anything explicit had happened. That was the problem. It was subtle. It was deniable. It was invisible to everyone but her. After the massage, she dressed in silence and stepped into the hallway, where Ray was waiting with a water bottle and his usual calm smile. "You okay?" he asked casually. "You seemed a little tense today." She nodded. "Just tired. Long week." He smiled. "Same time next week?" Elena hesitated, then nodded again before walking out. Outside, the sun had set. She got into her car, locked the doors, and just sat there. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, trying to understand why something so small had left her feeling so shaken. She didn't have proof. She didn't have bruises or marks or stories people would find dramatic enough to care about. But she had her instincts. And they were now screaming, even if she couldn't say exactly why. Elena sat across from Maria at their favorite coffee shop, stirring her tea long after it had gone lukewarm. She had tried to ignore the feeling from her last session with Ray, tried to move on. But the unease had built up like pressure behind her eyes, too much to carry in silence. So she finally said it out loud. "I think something happened during my massage," Elena said quietly, not meeting Maria's eyes. Maria looked up from her coffee, brows raised. "Something like what?" "I don't know exactly," Elena admitted. "It wasn't dramatic. But I felt uncomfortable. Like he touched me in a way that didn't feel professional." There was a long pause. Maria frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Ray? Are you sure? I mean, he's always been super respectful. Maybe it was part of the technique." Elena's stomach twisted. "Maybe. That's what I keep telling myself. You know I love you, right?" Maria said gently. "But sometimes we're so on edge from work, stress, lack of sleep. Maybe your mind's playing tricks on you." That stung more than she expected. She nodded anyway, pretending to consider it. But inside, something recoiled. She hadn't expected instant validation, but hearing her best friend suggest she was imagining things left her feeling even more isolated. Over the next few days, Elena went over every session in her mind, dissecting them frame by frame like a detective searching for evidence. Had she misread a gesture? Was it her trauma talking? She remembered the calm voice, the careful hands. She had trusted him. Still, something had shifted, hadn't it? The worst part was the doubt, not just in Ray, but in herself. She debated canceling her next appointment, but instead, she decided to go. Not to relax, not to heal, but to watch. She needed clarity. She needed to know if it had all been in her head or if her instincts had been right. When she arrived, Ray seemed different. Still polite, still calm, but distant. He didn't ask how her week had been. He didn't offer any jokes. He moved through the session with robotic precision, never touching the areas he normally would. No lingering, no tension. And yet, that only made things worse. It felt like he knew. Like he was being cautious, careful to erase any trace of what had happened or what might have. The air was stiff, filled with unspoken tension neither of them acknowledged. Elena left feeling more confused than ever. If nothing had happened, why did he act like something had? If she had imagined it, why was her chest tight with shame? As she drove home, the sky darkening with summer storm clouds, she whispered to herself the question she dreaded the most. What if I'm right, and no one ever believes me? Elena hesitated as her hand hovered over the door handle of the wellness studio. Her last session with Ray had been cold, emotionally distant, eerily calculated. It should have reassured her, confirmed that maybe nothing had really happened. But it didn't. It only deepened her confusion. This time, she told herself she was going for closure. One last session. One last chance to either confirm her doubts or silence them for good. Ray greeted her as usual, soft-spoken, composed, but something in his eyes felt unreadable, as if he knew this session carried a different weight. He didn't make small talk. Neither did she. Elena lay on the table, muscles tense before the massage even began. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. His touch was firm, clinical, the way it used to be. But as the session went on, the atmosphere shifted again. There was no clear change, just a subtle drift in his movements, a quiet inching toward lines that should never be crossed. And then, it happened. His hand slid lower. Not by accident. Not like before. There was nothing ambiguous about it this time. It was intentional. The touch was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably wrong. Elena froze, her breath caught in her chest. Every cell in her body screamed at her to move, to say something, to stop him, but her voice felt locked behind a wall of disbelief and rising panic. She couldn't process that someone she trusted, someone she had convinced herself was professional, had just violated that trust in the most visceral way. She jerked up suddenly, heart pounding, yanking the sheet around her as she sat upright on the table. Ray stepped back immediately, hands raised slightly, as if he were the one surprised. "Elena, wait, I thought we had a connection." Those words. They hit harder than the act itself. A connection? As if she had invited this? As if her smiles, her small talk, her vulnerability had been permission? "No," she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "That's not what this is. That's never what this was." She dressed quickly, shaking, not even looking in the mirror as she pulled on her clothes. Ray stood by the door, saying nothing now, just watching her with unreadable eyes. As she stepped past him, he whispered, "Please don't make this into something it's not." But it already was. Outside, Elena stumbled into the fresh air, her legs unsteady. The sky was heavy with clouds, mirroring the chaos inside her. She sat in her car for a long time, hands clenched tightly in her lap, the heat rising around her, but she felt frozen. It was no longer a question of instinct, no longer a matter of reading between the lines. The line had been crossed. Clearly. Unforgivably. And now she had to decide what came next. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, the room dim except for the pale light leaking through the blinds. Her hands were still trembling hours later, long after she had left the studio. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't cried. She just sat there numb, trying to piece herself back together. Her thoughts were loud and cruel. Why didn't you stop him sooner? Why did you go back? Did you smile too much? Were you too friendly? Self-blame coiled around her like a vice, choking the voice inside her that had screamed. He crossed the line. He knew exactly what he was doing. But shame has a strange way of silencing the truth, especially when it whispers in your own voice. She picked up her phone 3 times to call someone. Maria? No, she'd already dismissed her concerns once. Her sister? Maybe. But how do you explain something that sounds so vague, so lacking in proof? There were no bruises, no witnesses, no physical evidence. Just a moment, a horrible, violating moment that had changed everything. Eventually, she dialed anyway. Her younger sister, Ava, answered on the 3rd ring. Elena? Are you okay? That was all it took. The words came out broken and fragmented, pauses, stutters, deep breaths in between. Ava listened in silence. Not once did she interrupt or ask the wrong questions. When Elena finally stopped speaking, there was a pause. Then Ava said the 4 words she hadn't known she needed. I believe you, Lena. Tears poured from Elena's eyes at last, the dam breaking. That simple affirmation cracked through the guilt, the self-doubt, the fear that had coiled itself into her bones. I don't know what to do, Elena whispered. Whatever you decide, Ava said gently, I'll support you. But you're not crazy. And you're not alone. In the following days, Elena wrote everything down. Every memory, every moment she questioned, every time her gut had told her something felt off. It wasn't for court, at least not yet. It was for herself. A record. A truth. Proof for when the self-doubt returned, because she knew it would. She debated reporting him. She looked up the complaint process. She started to fill out the form, then deleted it. Started again. Stopped. Started again. Ray had a spotless reputation in the community. Everyone trusted him. Would they believe her? Or would they see her as a woman who misunderstood a kind gesture? That's what she feared the most, not just being doubted, but being dismissed. So for now, she waited. She healed. She wrote. She breathed. And she remembered Ava's voice. You're not alone. It wasn't everything. But it was enough to keep her going for now. It started with a post. Late one night, Elena was scrolling through social media, still caught in that in-between space, healing, but haunted. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Just something to drown out the thoughts. But then she stopped cold. A woman, username unfamiliar, had shared a thread. I debated for months about writing this. But something happened during a massage session that I can't ignore anymore. It made me feel powerless, confused, and ashamed. I know I'm not the only one. Elena's heart began to race. The story was vague, just enough detail to protect the woman's identity, but not so vague that it was unrecognizable. The timing, the tone, the therapist. It was him. Ray. There it was. Validation. Recognition. A crack in his polished image. Elena sat in stunned silence, rereading the post. She wasn't alone, and never had been. With trembling fingers, she messaged the woman privately. I think the same thing happened to me. Can we talk? What followed was a conversation full of heartbreak, fear, and strength. The woman's name was Leah. Her story mirrored Elena's almost exactly. Same manipulations. Same slow erosion of boundaries under the disguise of professionalism. Soon, a 3rd woman joined. Then a 4th. Each had doubted herself. Each had tried to bury it. But now, they had each other. Together, they decided to take the next step. They reached out to a lawyer who specialized in professional misconduct and reported Ray to the licensing board. It wasn't easy. They had no video, no damning evidence, only their stories, woven with consistency and pain. But together, their voices became undeniable. Elena gave her full statement. She brought in her journal entries, texts she'd sent her sister, even the notes she'd scribbled after that awful final session. Her hands shook the entire time. But she did it. When the board launched an official investigation, Elena felt the first real breath of justice. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. News spread fast in the community. Reactions were mixed. Some people were horrified, offering support and apologizing for ever doubting her. Others defended Ray, saying things like, "He's always been kind to me," or "This feels like a misunderstanding." But Elena stayed quiet through the noise. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She had spoken her truth. And now it was out there. Weeks later, she stood outside the wellness studio with Leah and the others. A sign on the door read, "Closed until further notice." Ray had been suspended pending investigation. Elena stared at the sign, not with triumph, but with a strange mix of grief and relief. Part of her still mourned the person she had once trusted. But more than that, she was proud of the woman she had become. A woman who no longer stayed silent. 6 months had passed since Elena last stepped foot inside that studio. Ray's license had been revoked. The board found sufficient evidence of unethical conduct based on multiple testimonies. Though he was never criminally charged due to lack of hard evidence, his professional career was over. And for Elena, that mattered. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. About stopping him from ever doing it again. But justice, she learned, wasn't the same as healing. Some mornings she woke up feeling strong, certain, even proud. Other mornings, she still flinched at the thought of being alone in a room with a stranger. She avoided massage studios altogether now. The scent of eucalyptus oil made her stomach twist. And when she passed men who smiled a little too easily, she caught herself shrinking into herself again. Healing wasn't a straight path. It was messy, nonlinear, exhausting. But it was also real. She started therapy. Real therapy. With a licensed trauma counselor who helped her unravel all the threads she'd tightly knotted within herself for years. It wasn't just about Ray. It was about trust, identity, the pressure to stay silent, and the fear of not being believed. Sometimes, during sessions, she cried without knowing why. Other times, she just sat quietly, letting silence do the work. But week by week, Elena began to rebuild something inside her. Not the version of herself before the incident, but someone wiser, more grounded, more awake. She found comfort in simple things: walks near the ocean, her sister's phone calls, journaling late at night. She even joined an online support group for survivors of professional misconduct, where she shared her story, anonymously at first, then eventually in her own name. And then one day, she received a message. A young woman wrote, "I was thinking about seeing the same therapist you reported. I saw your post and changed my mind. Thank you for speaking up. You may have saved me from the same experience." Elena stared at the message for a long time, tears stinging her eyes. That single sentence made every moment of doubt and fear worth enduring. She didn't need a court verdict to validate her. She had her voice. And she had used it. The past would always be a part of her story, but it no longer controlled her. She could finally speak about what happened without shaking, without shame. And that was its own kind of power. As she stood at the shoreline one cool morning, toes pressed into the wet sand, waves curling around her feet, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "It wasn't my fault. And I'm still here." She breathed deep. Not completely healed, but healing, and that was enough. 64.